Social Security or something like that through a payroll tax, the employer is actually not directly involved. In other words, it's administered by the government, and you get the benefit from the government, just like you do with Social Security. So there's no reason to exclude any particular employer. The logic of the exclusion under FMLA was that, the employer had to administer it and it would be a burden on small business, which isn't necessarily the case.
There's a new tax in New York State that goes along with this, a little payroll tax.
A very small payroll tax. And the reason it's so small, as in the other states that already have done this, is that while most people will have a kid at some point in their careers, the incidence of, in any given year, the likelihood that anyone's going to draw on this benefit is relatively small. So you're paying into it every month for an event that might happen a few times in the course of a, 50-year working career or something like that. So that's why it's very inexpensive.
It's a classic insurance model or a socialized benefit model. Is that what the federal law or the bill that's now before the Senate would involve, an additional little payroll tax for all American workers?
That's correct. Only the difference is in the proposed Family Act, that's the national bill that's, like I said, languishing in Congress. It would actually be split, the payroll contributions, like Social Security, between the worker and the employer, which is different from the New York and California programs, which both are only a tax on workers. In my view, it doesn't really matter because the employer is going to extract that tax from the worker back if they are required to pay it. People will get raises less frequently or something like that. So that's sort of not an important difference. But anyway, that is one difference in the federal proposed law, which of course is subject to negotiation still. So who knows what it will end up like if it ever passes.
We're talking about the history and present state of family and medical leave as an issue in presidential campaigns and at the state level, with sociology professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, Ruth Milkman, author of books including Unfinished Business, Paid Family Leave in California and the Future of U.S. Work-Family Policy, and On Gender, Labor, and Inequality, the Working Class in American History, which comes out in paperback this July. Let's talk about some of the history that we went over in that tape segment. Maybe the biggest thing in the history of this issue is that the first President Bush vetoed it twice. Bill Clinton made it an issue running against him and made it the first bill he signed into law when he got inaugurated in 1993. What did Bush have against unpaid 12 weeks of family leave or medical leave for your own illness as a federal guarantee?
Well, I can't read the first Bush's mind, but the lobbyists who opposed it were from the business world. And that was true of all the state laws for paid leave that have been passed as well. So the chambers of commerce, groups like that, are the ones who oppose it. If you look at polling data, the vast majority of Americans on both sides of the aisle, even, older white male religious conservatives, the majority of them support paid family leave. The only opposition comes from organized business, and they make arguments which our research shows are groundless, but they claim that, this will be impossible for businesses to survive and that the sky will fall on the U.S. economy if such laws exist. We know that every country but the United States in the advanced capitalist world has paid family leave of some kind and has had it for many decades. And now we have 4 states that have it, and the sky has not fallen. So, those arguments are problematic. But as you know, the business community, the chambers of commerce, and so on, oppose any kind of labor legislation, not just this, routinely. They don't really want the government telling them what to do. And although in this case, they don't really have to do much except, take the person back after they go away.
And I guess as we heard in those clips of Senator Dodd and Senator Hatch from 1992, there was a majority of Congress, enough to pass the bill and send it to the president's desk twice, the first President Bush, but when he vetoed it, they didn't have a big enough majority to override it.
That's correct. So, the other issue here that we haven't really touched on, but I think is really important, is that this very much intersects with the big issue of the day, that is inequality in the United States. Because the way it is now, in the absence of paid leave, many workers do have paid leave, but they tend to be the more privileged workers. So the ones that employers consider valuable to retain. So many employers do provide for, managers and professionals some kind of paid leave. It may not be called paid family leave, but they offer something like that. But to low-wage workers typically have nothing. And so these programs, these government programs, would fix that and level the playing field. And, that has already been the case in the states that have begun to roll these things out. And that's what the Family Act would do, because they are universal. They cover everyone. So it's not just a voluntary act by an employer who really doesn't want to lose, some valuable attorney on their staff and therefore offers her or him some kind of paid leave. This is for everyone.
In the 1970s, when New York, New Jersey, and 3 other states first included maternity leave in their disability insurance program, from a labeling perspective, it was disability. Today, we like to think of having a baby as normal and healthy, not a disability.
Yeah.
But on a benefits level, maybe it's still, I don't know if it still has that label in the New York law, but how does the New York bill cover men?
It doesn't cover them as disabled. So the U.S. is very peculiar in that pregnancy is considered a disability. That's a whole complicated history, which we probably don't have time to get into. But for the paid family leave, as opposed to pregnancy leave, which is what was implemented in New York and those other states in the 70s, the new paid family leave thing is available to men bonding with a new baby or caring for a seriously ill family member, just as it is to women. And in fact, if there are a male and female parent in the household of the same child, they can take it sequentially, as long as they're, providing care for that baby. So it's gender neutral, and that's true in all the other states that have it as well as the proposed federal law.
And so under the law, men could also take off the same amount of time to care for an elderly relative
Yes.
as well, though of course that too tends to be women.
Yes, but they could. And actually in California, which has had this the longest since 2004 when they first implemented it, the numbers of men, the percentages of men who are eligible, who are taking up to benefit, has gone steadily upward. So there's a lot of interest among especially younger male workers in doing this, particularly for new babies. And by the way, the relative does not have to be elderly. It can be any sick family member, including a child.
Ruth Milkman, sociology professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and author of books including On Gender, Labor, and Inequality, which comes out in paperback this July. Thank you very much for joining us and helping us talk about the history and current state of family and medical leave in the United States.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's part 1 in our 30 issues series for this week on this issue. Tomorrow, we'll compare countries around the world on their family and medical leave policies. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up next, Angela Duckworth, who, if you've heard the word grit used a lot in the last few years with respect to kids in school, it's her fault. And we'll talk to Angela Duckworth about grit next.
We really do get a bad rap, but as my colleague Ellie Kemper explains, it's really just a matter of perspective.
I think for a person, I think that I'm sort of emotional, I think I'm a little sensitive, I'm a little tightly wound. For an actress, I am like the most normal I've ever met.
This is Alec Baldwin, host of Here's the Thing. This week we talk bathroom fixtures, favorite ice cream flavors, and season 2 of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Take a listen at here'sthething.org.
WNYC support comes from The Humans, a new play by Stephen Karam, directed by Joe Mantello, on Broadway at the Helen Hayes Theater. Tickets available at thehumansonbroadway.com. The Brian Lehrer Show is supported in part by the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Foundation.
Later today on This American Life, for David, prom night was the culmination of years of effort.
I changed a lot since sophomore year. I got into this crowd and stuff, and I changed my speech, my dress, and all that stuff. I'm still the same person. Nice change. I'm just, this is a popular crowd. I'm just popular in there. The most gorgeous girl in school. I asked her to prom. She says yes.
Prom night, damn, prom night, later. Tonight at 8 on 93.9 FM, WNYC.
And tomorrow on the Brian Lehrer Show, I'll talk with Seymour Hersh, whose story of the Navy SEALs and the demise of Osama bin Laden is very different than the official narrative we've heard. He says the version we all know is a lie. Hear the truth as Seymour Hersh sees it in his book, The Killing of Osama bin Laden, tomorrow on the Brian Lehrer Show. NYC, and when Angela Duckworth won one of the MacArthur Genius Awards in 2013, it had an extra resonance for her, probably, given that as a child her father would frequently remind her, "You're no genius." And her award was for her work proving that sheer talent, or genius, isn't such a good predictor of success, as it turns out. She's a psychology professor at Penn and the founder and scientific director of the Character Lab there. Her new book is all about the character trait that her research shows is singularly important to achievement. It's called Grit, the Power of Passion and Perseverance. Angela Duckworth, welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
So the word grit and the name Angela Duckworth have become so associated these last few years in education circles, maybe since your TED Talk or other things that you put out. How do you define it?
I define grit as the combination of perseverance, but also passion for an extremely challenging and long-term goal.
Long-term goal.
That's
which
right.
Not every student in 7th grade considers studying for the next math test.
Well, an important thing to remember about kids in 7th grade, and I used to teach middle school, so I remember this myself as a teacher, is that they're still developing their interests. I don't think it's realistic to consider that a 7th grader or an 8th grader or even a 10th or 11th grader would have that kind of singular goal that guides everything that they do. It is what I see in mature paragons of grit, and it is, I think, an aspiration. Kids should be thinking, how can I lead my life in a way that ultimately I'll find something that I'm still in love with day after day.
And you found that the question you wanted to devote your life to answering was apparent to you while teaching math. First here in school on the Lower East Side, and then in California, I see, and noticing that it was the hard workers who did better, not necessarily the kids for whom math came naturally, and you wanted to figure out why.
I think that every teacher sees in their classroom this range of from the low achievers to the high achievers, and I was interested, I was fascinated, I guess you could say I was obsessed with the question of why it wasn't just their talent that explained those differences, and that set me on the journey to grit.
And should I think it's not just willpower? Since grit you define as passion and perseverance, you first have to have the passion.
Well, it's a debate, actually, whether passion comes first or perseverance. And in any case, I think you can say that without both, you're not really gritty. If you're just working hard at something because you have to, or you're being forced to by your parents, that's not grit the way I define it.
Well, then, what would provide the typical kid that grit at however early an age you want to identify? Is the passion, or what would provide the passion? Is the passion just to get good grades because you're very achievement oriented and you want to go to Harvard and that's the motivator, or to do ordinary schoolwork? What is the source of the passion?
No, I think most kids find their passion outside of the classroom, not inside of the classroom. And it's not to say that what happens inside of the classroom isn't important. Of course it is. But for a lot of kids, including my own, they're discovering their passions playing football or being in the school play or writing for the newspaper. It's for that reason I think that extracurricular activities, which are practically going extinct in some of our lesser affluent neighborhood schools, it's so important to bring them back.
Now, this book is not just about childhood and educational success. You're also writing that grit for adults.
That's right. I actually haven't met anybody, whatever their age, who isn't at least in some way interested in becoming better at what they do.
Listeners, have you read Angela Duckworth, or maybe seen her TED Talk, or talking about it with your fellow teachers in your prep periods, or anything you want to ask Angela Duckworth about grit? 212-433-WNYC 433-9692. Her new book is Grit, the Power of Passion and Perseverance. And you've developed a grit scale, I see, where people can answer questions to determine just how gritty they are. We link to it on our website, and people have to say where they fall on a scale of just like me to not like me, for statements like, new ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones, and my interests change from year to year. So a high grit score would be if new ideas don't distract you from previous ones?
Yeah, I use the word passion in a way that maybe not everyone uses. I think when many people think about passion, they think of fireworks of intensity. I stayed up all night researching this thing. But passion, the way I'm defining it, is sustained interest over time. Not just falling in love with something, but really staying in love with that same thing.
Is there a competing value, though, like curiosity or quick thinking or breadth of interests?
I do think there is a trade-off that we all have to face in life, which is depth versus breadth. You cannot be a specialist in one thing, but also have extraordinarily diverse interests that you are pursuing with energy. There is a choice to be made, and I think to be gritty is to choose, to some extent, to sacrifice those other interests so that you can become really excellent at one of them.
Let's take a phone call. And here's Brian in Park Slope. Brian, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, yeah. I found it extremely interesting. When I was in high school, I began to get a passion for art, and I would shift 3 nights a week, like not sleeping, to pursue the projects throughout my entire junior and senior year, and all the way through college the same way. And I show in a gallery in New York, but I teach now, and I'm trying to teach grit to my students, and I lost a good portion of my last class doing that, and it's wondering if you happen to have any suggestions on ways to inspire grit, or if it's just something that is a person has and you can kind of nudge it and just hope that the other ones catch on.
I think the first thing that you surely do is you do model it, right? I mean, you sound like yourself, you're very gritty, and I think that helps, by the way. But as you pointed out, it's not necessarily a complete solution, because it sounds like there were some kids who couldn't take it, and dropped your class, even though that was not your point. I think that nudging it is exactly the language I would use. You can't expect somebody to go from zero grit to Olympic athlete in the course of days or weeks. You have to meet them where they are. And I think maybe if you could remind them, and I think this is hard sometimes, if you yourself are a paragon of grit, remind them that, the journey was exactly that you weren't always the way you are today. And maybe
you don't think it's a millennial thing, do you?
Well, I have very strong opinions about millennials, and here's what I think. We sort of beat up on these 20-somethings, all the time. Like they don't work hard enough, they whine, and they, like, why isn't my career happening like it happens in the movies? And the truth is that if you look at the research on my data, my tables, I can see very clearly that the millennials are less gritty than 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old. I mean, the older you are, the grittier you are in my data. But here's the thing. If you look historically at studies of personality, there's nothing all that different about the young adults we are berating today compared to the young adults in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it might not be that they're millennials who are lazy because of cultural forces. It might just be that they are young adults who haven't quite grown up yet.
Brian, thanks, and good luck teaching grit to your next class. Related to that, here's a tweet from a listener who says, I wonder if the last 10 years of growing social media obsession has diminished overall stick-to-itiveness. Because if you're talking about perseverance, and we're living in an increasingly ADD kind of culture, then does that work against grit?
I think it's a really important thing to note that the distractions today abound in ways that are truly historically unprecedented. You can go all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, where Francis Galton said, there are hourly temptations that are, there lying in wait, diverting us from what we really should be doing. And I don't know what life was like in 1869, but there've got to be more temptations and distractions today. So, to this tweeter's point, I think that's, potentially antithetical to grit. But I will say this, when people are really determined and they really love what they do, they find it possible to be away from those distractions, to kind of take them out of their lives, because they know that they're going to have their attention eroded, and therefore, they turn off, their cell phone, things like that.
Now, the idea of developing character in school has become so popular that California schools now want to include that in teacher evaluations, and I see you're very much opposed to that.
I am, and that might be surprising to some listeners, but I absolutely think that grading schools, teachers, or students on their grit in any kind of high-stakes way is not at all a good idea. You know, the measures themselves are not accurate enough. They're completely fakeable. There are 1,000 other problems, but maybe just as important, you know, if you want your kids to be gritty and kind and generous, honest, curious people, is the way to do that through rewards and punishments? As a psychologist, I don't think so.
As opposed to?
As opposed to modeling it in the classroom. You know, the teacher who just called in the first time, I mean, that is somebody who genuinely cares about the development of their students. He's modeling grit. Does he have it all figured out? Maybe not. But I think that genuine, you know, the kind of authenticity of a teacher who's trying to encourage grit, I think you kind of bludgeon that when you say, oh, by the way, you know, your salary depends on it, or, you know, we're going to rank your school based on this questionnaire score.
Tori in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Tori.
Hi. First of all, I have to say that I love this idea of grit. I've never heard it before. This is a newbie for me, but I love it. I had just turned 70, so I'm not going to have access to any modeling in the classroom. What I'm curious is whether you have looked at where the quality comes from in the first place. Is it, I mean, in the developmental world, is it innate? Is it, and I also don't know what you have said about the conscious mind's ability to access grit, which may not have been part of my life up till now, but can I get there?
All right, can a 70-year-old who suddenly has an epiphany and says, I want to develop grit, do it?
I think a 70-year-old who's really interested in developing a passion that's not only interesting, but also purposeful, also important. A 70-year-old who says, you know, I wonder if I could learn to practice something every day and try to get a little better with feedback. I think a 70-year-old who says, you know, when I fall down, when I screw up, when I make a mistake, can I figure out a way to focus on what I can control and do better the next time? I think that 70-year-old absolutely can develop in grit. And by the way, the 70-year-old still has the same DNA that he or she inherited from mom and dad back all the way to birth. And I want to say this about the nature-nurture question that this listener brings up. The answer is very clear. For everything that you can care about, you know, grit or anything else about you, it's both. Yes, you were definitely influenced by your genes, but your life experience and your attitude and the people around you, they all matter as well.
Angela Duckworth with us, psychology professor at Penn and founder and scientific director of their Character Lab. Her new book is Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And Michael in the Bronx, you're on WNYC. Hi, Michael.
Hi, first-time caller, long-time listener. Thank you very much, Brian, for having the show. It's really informative.
Thank you.
Grit. It's been described by the Irish for years and years and years as perseverance and passion, just like your guest is describing. My question is, when do you have a separation between grit and unreality or obtusiveness? Like, when does grit give way to self-deception?
There is, I think, a misapplication of grit, you know, grit gone bad. And it's this: if you're really stubborn about some kind of low-level goal, and I'm saying low-level because when you think about your goals, some of them are actually more important, more meaningful than others. A low-level goal is something that you might have on your to-do list for today or next week. But if you ask yourself, well, why is that on my to-do list? Why do I need to send back that email or finish that, you know, piece of writing? It's because it serves a higher level goal. Like, well, I'm trying to get this client to, you know, be interested in our company. You know, if you keep going up and you ask why, you ultimately get to a top level goal. You know, for the Seahawks coach Pete Carroll, it is to always compete, you know, to always be his best. It's very abstract, really. But everything under that one goal in this pyramid serves that purpose. Here's when grit can go bad. If you're really stubborn about some trivial low-level goal and you just can't see the bigger picture, then you can make really bad decisions. But honestly, I don't think there's anything at all dangerous about being incredibly tenacious about that one top-level goal that rules all the others.
Grit gone bad. Interesting concept. One other pushback to the idea of schools focusing on developing grit is how it plays out along class lines. Some teachers feel that it's very close to saying poverty is caused by a lack of grit and not outside social forces, and the answer is developing the ability of kids to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and not providing social support, which would make it really attractive to a certain type of conservative. How do you respond to that criticism?
I can empathize with this concern because I was a teacher in urban classrooms. Many, if not most, of my kids came from poverty, and I've also sat in classrooms now as a psychologist studying what's going on. And when school systems come to me and they say, we would like you to come and make our kids grittier, that's the only thing we need to do, go for it. I have to hesitate because in some of these schools I don't see basic needs being met. Kids need books, for example. Kids need teachers who actually try to teach them something and have the skill. And teaching is a very, very highly skilled craft. The skill to be able to do all those things. I think the question of grit versus social support is not at all the right way to think about things. Grit and social support go hand in hand. Without one, you can't have the other.
And I think we have a related question from Daniel in Manhattan. Daniel, you're on WNYC with Angela Duckworth. Hi.
Hi, Angela. I've been reading your research for a number of years now, and I am not a teacher, but had kids that had difficulty in school. So I was glad to hear you say that you don't support grading grit, because my concern is, while I support this concept, I think it really hits on something crucial. My concern is that it becomes then the thing that you tutor a kid on so that he can ace the test, and then you basically turn a kid into like a unidimensional being, and all you're developing is this one thing that has been put together so that it can be graded on a test.
About 40 years ago, there was a great social scientist named Don Campbell, and he came up with what he called Campbell's Law. And that is, anytime a social scientist like me comes up with a measure and high stakes are added to it, right? Now the score matters. Now you're either going to get into college or you're not going to get into college. Your salary depends on it. Your privileges depend on it. Then what happens is the measure becomes perverted. People game it, just like you said. And I really hope that doesn't happen to things like the grit scale. The grit scale was designed for research, and the grit scale was designed for self-reflection. Nothing more and nothing less than that.
So, last question. Does grit help get you to character or just to success?
I define character the way Aristotle defined character, which is very broadly. Aristotle said that character is everything about yourself that helps you lead a life that's good for you and good for other people. So I think grit is one part of character, certainly not all of it. It's important to be honest and kind. It's important to be empathic. It's important to be curious. Grit is none of those things. Altogether, though, I think it adds up to what Aristotle would say is the good life.
And we leave it there with words of wisdom from Aristotle via Angela Duckworth, professor of psychology at Penn and founder and scientific director of their Character Lab. Her new book is Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. And for some of you in Westchester who might want to go see and hear Angela Duckworth in person tonight, she will be at the Chappaqua Library, 7 o'clock tonight. Angela Duckworth reading from Grit at the Chappaqua Library, 7 o'clock tonight. Thank you so much for coming and talking about it with us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. And on a related note, Sunday was National Decision Day for high school seniors and their parents making the choice to go or not to go to college, in which one. So now we're going to do a brief call-in for the end of the show here. For anyone who had a close call decision to make, or if your child did, about what school to choose, what was your choice? How did you decide between the ones that were the finalists? And we also want to hear from anyone who decided if you are not going to go to college next year. Instead, you're going to take a gap year, or maybe your child did that. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. So if you are one of the more than 3 million high school students graduating this spring, we want to know if you had a close call about what college to go to, assuming you're going on to college. which were your finalist schools, and how did you finally decide which one to choose between or among them? 212-433-WNYC. And if you have decided to take a gap year, how difficult a decision was that? And what are you going to do with your gap year? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. While your calls are coming in, according to the Wall Street Journal, 2/3 of graduating seniors are expected to attend college in the fall. That is so way up from the past in American history, even though we only have about 30% of the population that's four-year college grads. We now have 2/3 of graduating high school seniors expected to attend college in the fall, at least to start. 77% of students from families in the top income quartile will earn a bachelor's degree before they turn 24. So there's your perpetuation of income inequality. If you already come from the top quarter of earning parents, you have a 77% chance of finishing at least a bachelor's degree. That number's been increasing steadily since the 70s, when 40% in the top quartile obtained a college degree.